Now, the tag team we're talking about today, of course, most remember as Axe and Smash, and there were other members that we'll get into than the traditional two that most are familiar with. But the debut actually went down before you were there, Bruce. It was January of 1987. We're going to touch on that briefly. Most of us remember Smash as Barry Darsow, but he was formerly in the Jim Crockett Promotions and working lots of independents, doing a Russian gimmick as Crusher Khrushchev. So he's appearing all over in the NWA doing that character. And some of our younger fans may remember him as Repo Man and Blacktop Bully. Neither one of those were nearly as successful as Crusher Khrushchev and Smash. But when Smash was originally debuted, it wasn't Barry Darsow. Who was it?
It was a gentleman by the name of Randy Colley, who most people will probably remember as Moondog Rex.
And Moondog Rex is one half of the Moondogs tag team. And for those younger listeners who aren't familiar with the Moondogs, can you describe their gimmick or tell us some of their favorite memories or matches, or what can you share with us about the Moondogs?
Well, the Moondogs were a unique combination of guys. They both had bleach blonde, almost white hair. And I don't really know how you could classify the gimmick, but they both wore jeans that were kind of cut off with rope for belts, and they chewed on giant bones. So they were Moondogs, the original Moondog Lonnie Main. I guess they were kind of a takeoff on Moondog Main way back in the day. But they were very colorful. You had Moondog Spot, who was Sailor White Thomas, and Moondog Rex, who was Randy Colley, and there was another Moondog out there from time to time as well.
So let's talk a little bit about how that comes about, because there's lots of rumor and innuendo that Demolition is actually Randy Colley's idea. And I think Bill Eadie is the guy who's kind of put this out there. And then, of course, I know they debuted a little while before you joined, but what do you remember about whose idea this Demolition concept was? Was it Randy Colley's? Was it Vince McMahon's? Who deserves the credit for this, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, obviously, as you stated several times, I wasn't there when it came out, but I do know from talking to Randy Colley, because I remember Randy way back from his Nightmare days in the Mid-South Wrestling, and I've always heard that it was Randy Colley's idea, that Randy approached Vince with this idea of a tag team with the masks and the makeup, and they put he and Bill Eadie together. So from my best recollection, the original idea, or the germ of the idea, was Randy Colley's.
So how would you best describe in a few words what the Demolition gimmick is? And a lot of people are going to hear me ask that and say, oh, it was a Road Warrior ripoff. But it was a little different. But it was certainly after the Road Warriors. And we'll address the Road Warrior thing in a minute. But first, how would you describe it?
I think if you were going to describe Demolition, they were just two big, tough guys that kind of demolished all of their opponents, and they were rough and tough, and a very rugged tag team. I think that's the best way to describe them.
Catch me up a little bit about, and I'm fascinated by this because I didn't see it until later. Obviously, I was a kid, but they kind of look a little bit like,
S&M character?
Yeah. So where does that come about? Do you remember that kind of being the talk in the back amongst the boys? As a kid, of course, I didn't know what the hell that was, but now that I know who Jim Cornette is, I know exactly what S&M is.
What the hell?
It was a joke. These are jokes. We tell jokes on the show.
Yes, folks. That's the part where you go, ha ha, and then you tweet Jim Cornette, and then I get the phone call. But Demolition and the whole outlook, yeah, a little bit dominatrix-ish, if you're into that sort of thing. But I think there was also kind of a play on Jason from the Friday the 13th movies as well that was playing in there as well. They were trying to go for.
So let's talk about that, because that is part of their iconic outfit is the mask with, I guess it's a piece of leather affixed to the back. And I guess, as far as you understand, were the original masks spray painted or were they covered with leather?
That's a damn good question. I think that they were always kind of had the leather front on them. The ones that I ever saw up close, I think they were always leather. That's my recollection.
I felt like at one point I have seen some of the paint coming off, but that may have been when they added somebody like, Hacksaw for a one-off or something when he would paint his face. But essentially, it is just a hockey mask that you guys kind of gimmicked up with leather and studs and stuff. When you were there, was that something that the costume department was putting together, or in '87 did that really exist, where the guys coming up with it on their own?
At that point, it was possibly could have been something creative department came up with, but the guys were responsible for getting all of that stuff made and maintaining it. So they probably would have been responsible for that themselves. The talent would have been.
All right, so let's move away from the costume for a minute. I'm sure we'll come back eventually here. After a few appearances together, Eadie has went on record as saying that too many people recognize Colley from being one of the Moondogs, so they decided to replace him. And Eadie says the WWF suggested 4 other guys who were currently working in the WWF at the time to replace Colley, but Eadie didn't think it would work because he felt the fans would recognize those guys as other WWF performers, similar to the way they had the Moondogs. And it wasn't too long before this that Barry Darsow had reached out and contacted the WWF once his NWA contract had expired. And when Vince suggests Darsow, Eadie drives down to Charlotte, his old stomping grounds, to meet Darsow. And from there, the Demolition we all know was born. So that's Eadie's testimony. Is that the way you remember it going down?
That's the way that I heard it went down, yes. And I've heard directly from Vince that it was simply too much with people when they did Randy Colley under the Demolition face paint and so on and so forth, that the crowds, especially in the Northeast, were chanting Moondog, Moondog every time that Randy got into the ring. And Vince just didn't feel that was going to work and decided they needed to get someone else.
So I'm curious, what's coming here. If it's Randy's idea and the WWF and Demolition made a mint with this, or I guess Eadie and Darsow did, do you know, did Colley ever receive any sort of compensation, to the best of your understanding, for coming up with this iconic gimmick that everybody made money from except him?
Probably not, but again, when you talk about guys coming up with ideas, people come up with ideas all the time and other people use them. And Vince is notorious for that someone may give him an idea and he'll use it for someone else. And that's one of the first things that he'll tell you when you talk to him, and especially if you're talking about creative and say, hey, Vince, I've got an idea. He'll say, hey, I really like that. I don't see it for you, but I see it for someone else. And he'll use it for somebody else.
Do you think
that's just the creative world? That happens every day in Hollywood, television, music. It's the way it works.
Do you think that is fair, or, life's not fair, pal?
Life's not fair. And you can go through a singer at a country fair doing an original song, and Steven Tyler listens to it and picks up on it. He makes it famous. Is that fair? He's the one that made it famous. So that's just the creative game and how it goes sometimes. You may hear an idea, or someone will say something to somebody else 6 times removed. By the time it gets to you, it may have been someone else's original idea. But you've heard me say a million times, somebody will say something, I go, I'm stealing that.
Yeah.
I'm making my own.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just wondered, especially since there's been a recent controversy, and I'm not trying to take too much of a sidetrack here, with the whole broken gimmick and the Jarrett situation and the WWE and the Hardys and, who owns it. And the contention there is more of always a music analogy of the publisher is the person who owns the rights. So in this case, you would agree that it's Vince's company. The idea happened when it was under Vince's watch. So one way or another, Vince owns Demolition, not Colley or Eadie or anybody else.
Yeah, I think that's the way that most people see it.
So let's get into some background on both guys. We've said his name a few times. Axe was Bill Eadie, and he was said that he got into the business, kind of by accident. He was home for summer break from college one year. His neighbor was one of the athletic commissioners in Pennsylvania. And he invited Bill to go to the Pittsburgh Civic Center just to see a wrestling show. When he went, he got to go into the locker room and meet a lot of the guys. And the promoter that night asked if he'd ever thought about getting into wrestling because he was a big guy. So a few weeks later, he starts training with Larry Zbyszko to become a professional wrestler. And then after his wrestling career, he went on to become a teacher, and he would teach in Ohio. And before Eadie became Axe, you may remember him, some of our older listeners, as the Masked Superstar. And he wrestled as the Super Machine for a little bit in the WWF. Bolo Mongol. And he did, kind of a rip-off indie gimmick of Demolition. But Demolition is certainly, and I know a lot of older fans are going to disagree with this because they're marks for the Masked Superstar, but Demolition is his most iconic run in the business. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I think that probably for this generation it's going to be Demolition. To me, he was always the Masked Superstar. And to me, the Masked Superstar gimmick was such a strong gimmick, and it was the first time that I met Bill and actually got to be around him, and I thought he was an incredible performer. So, I think that he's been successful from the Mongols to the Masked Superstar on to Demolition, or all three pretty damn good gimmicks.
Barry Darsow grew up in Minnesota, and this is something we've talked about a lot on the show here. For whatever reason, Minnesota was a hotbed for wrestling during this point. He grows up as friends with the Road Warriors, Mr. Perfect, Wayne Bloom, Brady Boone, Nikita Koloff, John Nord, and Tony Schiavone's favorite wrestler, Tom Zink. They all start working out at the gym together, and they're bouncers at a bar that a lot of wrestling fans have heard about, Grandma B's. One day at Grandma B's, Darsow meets Eddie Sharkey, who we've talked about on the Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude shows, available now in the archives. Sharkey sees how big these guys are and recruits them all to become wrestlers. And Sharkey had rented out a church basement, and that's where they have a wrestling ring with a homemade ring and wooden beams. And then one day, Ole Anderson comes to take a look at them, and he took Animal, who was their first guy in the group to get in the business, and then Darsow would get in after that. So, as the Masked Superstar, who you mentioned a minute ago, we should mention that Bill Eadie is one of the first guys to body slam Andre the Giant. There's all the rumor and innuendo out there, the WWE narrative, that didn't happen before WrestleMania 3, but that's, of course, not true. Harley Race and Bill Eadie and a few others did as well. And Eadie had significant success in Georgia, winning their heavyweight title 4 times, and eventually the NWA National Heavyweight title. He had a run in the WWF prior to Demolition as the Masked Superstar for 83 and 84. We mentioned it a minute ago. You would see him have matches with Hulk Hogan, Bob Backlund, Jimmy Snuka, Sergeant Slaughter, all the major players. And then in 86, he became one of the Machines, which is kind of a fun thing they did in 86. You would see Blackjack as Big Machine, Andre the Giant as Giant Machine, and Eadie was Super Machine. And they had a brief run against the Heenan family there. And that causes, when that run kind of dies down, Eadie leaves and becomes the Masked Superstar in Florida. And he had a brief run there where he beat Lex Luger for the Southern title and then just dropped it back a couple weeks after. Meanwhile, Darsow is starting his career in Hawaii and New Zealand and then on to the NWA. He's bouncing around as part of this Russian group with Ivan and Nikita Koloff, and they had a hot feud with the Road Warriors and the Rock and Roll Express in the NWA, and even a tag title run there. He even went to win the Mid-Atlantic title at some point before his run winds up coming to an end in December of 86. So Eadie and Darsow, in their incarnation as Demolition, now that Colley's out, debut on February 8th on the Wrestling Challenge against S.D. Jones and Don Driggers. We haven't talked a lot about S.D. Jones here on the show before. Do you got any S.D. Jones stories you can share?
Special delivery S.D. Jones. S.D. was one of those guys who was from the Dominican Republic, and he was a great enhancement talent and just was missing that one little extra it factor to break on through to the other side, if you will. Great hand, great guy, dependable, but he was just missing it, in my opinion. But you talk about Bill Eadie and being before the Demolition and stuff. One of his runs as Masked Superstar was through the Mid-South area, and that was during the 3-week run that Terry Taylor had as a booker in Mid-South. I don't know how long he was there. 3 weeks was probably too long. but one of the all-time worst territory town killing finishes that ever took place in the Houston ring was done with Bill Eadie, Dick Murdoch, and Ted DiBiase and Dr. Death, where the finish of the match was to unmask the masked superstar. And Eadie was on his way out. Murdoch was on his way out. Murdoch hated Terry Taylor. Eadie quit because of Terry Taylor. And this was their last night in the territory. So they do a finish where you're supposed to unmask the guy. And everybody, when you have that finish, the audience is there to see the masked guy get unmasked and to see his face. So they do the finish. The heels go to the back into the dressing room. Eadie still with his mask. Eadie walks in the dressing room. DiBiase and Doc act like they're beating the door down. And Eadie tosses Ted a mask. Ted goes back out to the ring and holds the mask up. People never got to see Bill's face. But worse than that, Eadie worked in a black mask and threw a red mask out to Ted for Ted to go back out like he unmasked and he's got a red mask. Which is just a bullshit finish, and one of the reasons that probably Terry didn't last that long as far as being a booker in the business.
Well, so there you go. There's a little bit of, and I didn't even know all that. So that's a little bit of history lesson for us who maybe were more familiar with Eadie as a Demolition member. I feel like sooner or later we're just going to have to talk about it. In your opinion, and I know you've talked about this a lot on the show in the past, but some people are probably listening to this episode first. You've always been of the belief that Demolition is not a ripoff of the Road Warriors. Sell us on that. A lot of people are just of the opinion that Vince tried to sign the Road Warriors, and I guess I should ask that first. Do you know for sure that the Road Warriors received an offer and had a conversation and had a meeting with Vince at his house for a deal before Demolition debuted?
I don't know because I wasn't there. I'd always heard that Vince was interested in the Road Warriors. And what's his name? Colley had this idea for Demolition, and Vince went with Demolition. I also remember a meeting after I got there with the Road Warriors and Vince, and I don't even know if they met in person or not, but I do remember getting the phone call and being with Vince where he said we're going full steam ahead with Demolition and Powers of Pain, because the Road Warriors decided that they were not going to come in. And I want to say that was sometime late 1987, early 1988.
In your opinion, had Demolition, had the Road Warriors come in, would Demolition have essentially become cannon fodder for the Road Warriors? Would they have existed? Were they created to just be an opponent for an eventual feud with the Road Warriors, but when they didn't sign, Vince just kind of went the other way with it?
Well, I definitely think that they would have had a program, but I think that they were different enough, and the Road Warriors at the time had just that cult following, and they had a huge babyface following. Demolition were heels, and they were classic heels, especially in the WWF. And people, I didn't believe this, I didn't know it until you're there, and you really don't get it. People were either NWA and Crockett fans, or they were WWF fans. WWF fans, everything WWF was the greatest of all time. And NWA was a subpar regional promotion. NWA fans were the NWA was real wrestling, where real wrestlers are, and this is the best matches, and the WWF was New York Hollywood crap. So you really had two strong beliefs, and I just think that WWF audience would have accepted them as two different teams, not looking at them as similar.
As far as a conversation with Vince, do you recall any conversation with him about any sort of correlation between the two gimmicks?
No, not really, ever. Now, obviously, there were a lot of comparisons with Powers of Pain. Yes.
Let's hear what that sounds like.
Well, it's just no. It's just you look at the Powers of Pain and you look at the Road Warriors. They looked alike. They were both big bodybuilder teams. Demolition, neither one of those guys were bodybuilders. They didn't have that big look, and they were more of a working team. Whereas the Road Warriors and Powers of Pain were more of a kicking and stomping and punching team. It wasn't that there were differences and big enough differences that I didn't compare them. I mean, I really didn't. I see where people do because of the face paint.
Well, and the spikes, and I realize that the spikes are certainly different. You know, and one wears shoulder pads and one doesn't. But the black leather, the spikes, the face paint, I could see how a lot of people would make that correlation.
And I can see how people would make that correlation as well. Then the bell rang.